By 1943, the Italian home front was buckling under the immense strain of a failing war effort as the nation reached a breaking point. The initial enthusiasm for a new Roman Empire had long since evaporated, replaced by a pervasive sense of dread and exhaustion among the citizenry. Everyday life became a desperate struggle for survival, as the basic necessities required to sustain a population began to vanish from the marketplace. Severe shortages of food and fuel plagued cities from Milan to Naples, forcing families to spend hours in queues just to secure a meager ration. The black market thrived in this environment of scarcity, creating a stark divide between those who could afford to pay and those left with nothing. Compounding this domestic misery was the constant, terrifying threat of Allied air raids that brought the reality of total war directly to the doorstep. Sirens wailed across urban centers, sending terrified civilians scurrying into makeshift shelters as bombs rained down on residential neighborhoods and industrial hubs alike. The physical destruction of homes and infrastructure mirrored the psychological collapse of a society that no longer believed in the promises of its leaders. A widening chasm emerged between the regime's optimistic propaganda and the grim, daily struggle for survival that defined the lives of ordinary Italian people. State-controlled newspapers and radio broadcasts continued to speak of glorious victories, even as the actual front lines moved closer to the Italian border. This disconnect between the official narrative of strength and the tangible evidence of decline created a profound sense of betrayal among the public. As military defeats mounted on multiple fronts, public support for Mussolini plummeted, and the atmosphere in Italy became increasingly volatile and ripe for change. The once mighty Duce, who had promised a swift and decisive triumph, now appeared increasingly isolated and disconnected from the suffering of his own people. Whispers of dissent grew into open criticism in cafes and workplaces, as the fear of the secret police was slowly eclipsed by the overwhelming desire for peace. The population grew deeply weary of the ongoing conflict, and the leadership within the fascist hierarchy began to sense that the tide had turned irrevocably against them. Within the halls of power, the elite began to calculate the costs of continued loyalty to a regime that seemed destined for total collapse. This period established the crumbling foundation of the Italian state, setting the stage for a political crisis as the disconnect between rhetoric and reality intensified. The lived experience of the people finally reached a breaking point, creating the necessary conditions for the regime's eventual downfall and a shift in national power. The Allied invasion of Sicily, known as Operation Husky, served as the final catalyst that shattered the remaining illusions of the Italian military establishment. As Allied forces landed on the southern coast, the shockwaves traveled rapidly to Rome, forcing the leadership to confront the reality of an imminent invasion. The vulnerability of the Italian peninsula was laid bare, and the inability of the armed forces to repel the invaders signaled the end of the war effort. Panic rippled through the ranks of the government, as the realization dawned that the protection of the homeland was no longer a certainty. Mussolini, once the absolute master of the nation, found his authority challenged by those who had previously been his most loyal supporters and enforcers. The king, Victor Emmanuel III, began to contemplate the necessity of removing the dictator to save the monarchy and negotiate a separate peace. Behind closed doors, members of the Grand Council of Fascism started to organize, sensing that the time for a decisive intervention had finally arrived. The pressure from the military, the crown, and the desperate public converged into a singular movement aimed at dismantling the existing power structure. Secret negotiations with the Allies were initiated, as the new government sought a way to extricate Italy from the ruinous alliance with Nazi Germany. Every move was calculated to minimize further destruction while ensuring the survival of the state in the face of an encroaching and inevitable defeat. The arrest of Mussolini, orchestrated by the king and the Grand Council, marked the dramatic conclusion to the long period of domestic instability and decline. With the dictator removed, the nation stood at a precarious crossroads, waiting to see what the new government under Badoglio would ultimately achieve. The transition of power was sudden and chaotic, reflecting the deep divisions that had been festering within the Italian political system for many years. As the news of Mussolini's fall spread, a mixture of shock and relief swept through the streets, signaling the end of an era of repression. The people, exhausted by years of war and deprivation, looked toward the future with a mix of cautious optimism and profound uncertainty about what followed. The administrative machinery of the state began to shift, attempting to realign itself with the new reality of a nation seeking a path to peace. Diplomatic channels were opened with greater urgency, as the Badoglio government attempted to navigate the complex demands of the advancing Allied forces. The internal struggle for control of the nation's destiny intensified, with various factions vying for influence in the vacuum left by the collapse of fascism. Despite the change in leadership, the challenges facing Italy remained immense, with the country still occupied and the war far from being over. The legacy of the previous regime continued to haunt the political landscape, making the process of national reconciliation a difficult and arduous endeavor. Every decision made by the new government was scrutinized, as the eyes of the world turned toward Italy to see how it would handle the crisis. The infrastructure of the country lay in ruins, requiring a massive effort to restore even the most basic services for the suffering population. Social cohesion had been severely damaged, and the task of rebuilding a sense of national identity became a priority for the new administration. The war weariness that had fueled the downfall of Mussolini now became the driving force behind the public's demand for a swift conclusion to the fighting. International observers watched closely, recognizing that the situation in Italy was a bellwether for the broader collapse of the Axis powers in Europe. The strategic importance of the Italian peninsula meant that the conflict would continue to rage, regardless of the change in the local political leadership. The transition served as a stark reminder of how quickly a regime can crumble when it loses the support of the people it claims to represent. The history of the Italian home front during this period remains a testament to the resilience of ordinary people caught in the machinery of war. Their experiences, characterized by both tragedy and hope, define the complex legacy of Italy's struggle during the final years of the global conflict. As the dust settled on the political upheaval, the nation began to prepare for the long and painful process of rebuilding from the ashes. The removal of Mussolini did not immediately end the suffering, but it provided a necessary opening for the country to redefine its future path. The complex web of alliances and betrayals that defined the era continued to shape the geopolitical landscape long after the initial crisis had passed. Historians often point to this moment as a turning point, where the internal pressures of a failing state finally overwhelmed the external facade of power. The story of Italy in 1943 is one of profound transformation, illustrating the fragility of authoritarian rule when faced with the realities of total war. The lessons learned during these months of turmoil would influence the development of modern Italy, shaping its democratic aspirations for decades to come. The memory of the shortages, the bombings, and the political uncertainty remains etched in the collective consciousness of the Italian people today. It serves as a powerful reminder of the human cost of conflict and the importance of accountability in the exercise of political and military power. The collapse of the regime was not just a political event, but a profound social shift that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the nation's history. As we examine these events, we gain a deeper understanding of how societies react under extreme pressure and the mechanisms that lead to change. The narrative of Italy's home front is a compelling study in the dynamics of power, survival, and the enduring quest for peace in wartime. Ultimately, the events of 1943 underscore the resilience of a nation determined to emerge from the darkness of war into a new, uncertain future. This chapter of history remains a crucial piece of the puzzle in understanding the broader narrative of the Second World War and its lasting impact. The situation reached a critical breaking point in July 1943 when Allied forces launched Operation Husky, a massive invasion of the island of Sicily. This bold military maneuver sent immediate shockwaves through the Italian leadership, exposing the profound vulnerability of the mainland and the regime's crumbling defenses. The rapid success of the Allied landing shattered any remaining illusions of Italian military strength, highlighting the utter incompetence of the ongoing war effort. Panic rippled through the halls of power in Rome as the king and the Grand Council realized that the survival of the state was at stake. Faced with an existential threat, the inner circle of the fascist regime began to plot a desperate course of action to save their own positions. In a historic and tense meeting of the Grand Council, the dictator was finally stripped of his absolute power and removed from his office. The swift arrest of Mussolini marked the dramatic end of his 2 decades of rule, signaling the sudden and violent collapse of the fascist order. A new transitional government was quickly formed under Marshal Badoglio, tasked with the impossible job of navigating the country's increasingly precarious and dangerous position. Behind the scenes, the new administration immediately initiated secret, high-stakes negotiations with the Allies to secure an armistice and exit the global conflict. This transition represented the final, total collapse of the fascist regime, as the Italian state desperately attempted to pivot toward a new, uncertain reality. It was a nation forced to confront the harsh consequences of its failed imperial ambitions as the old world order dissolved in the face of defeat. The removal of the dictator did not bring immediate peace, but it fundamentally altered the trajectory of the war and the fate of the Italian people. As the news of the invasion spread, the civilian population in Italy felt a mixture of profound terror and a glimmer of weary hope. Years of relentless propaganda had promised glory, but the reality on the ground was defined by empty cupboards, cold homes, and constant fear. The Allied air raids had become a nightly ritual of destruction, turning once vibrant urban centers into smoldering ruins of brick and twisted metal. Food supplies had dwindled to critical levels, forcing families to survive on meager rations while the black market flourished in the shadows of scarcity. Fuel was virtually non-existent for the average citizen, leaving public transport paralyzed and the country's infrastructure struggling to maintain basic essential services. Public opinion, once carefully managed by the state, began to fracture under the weight of these daily hardships and the undeniable evidence of failure. People whispered in the streets, sharing news of the front lines that contradicted the optimistic reports broadcast by the state-controlled radio stations. The disconnect between the regime's triumphant claims and the grim reality of the war created a palpable tension that permeated every level of society. Mussolini, once the undisputed face of national pride, found his support evaporating as the military situation deteriorated with every passing day of the war. The Italian army, poorly equipped and demoralized, was suffering catastrophic losses, leaving the mainland exposed to the encroaching Allied forces from the south. Each defeat on the battlefield served as a stark reminder that the promises of a new Roman Empire were nothing more than hollow, dangerous rhetoric. The regime's inability to protect its own territory from invasion proved to be the final straw for many who had once been loyal supporters. In the corridors of the royal palace, King Victor Emmanuel III watched the unfolding disaster with growing alarm, sensing the imminent end of the monarchy. The king realized that to save the institution of the crown, he would eventually have to distance himself from the crumbling fascist leadership. Secret channels were opened, and quiet conversations began to take place among the elite, exploring ways to remove the dictator from the political stage. The atmosphere in Rome became thick with conspiracy, as key figures in the government weighed the risks of a sudden, decisive political maneuver. Operation Husky served as the catalyst that finally forced these long-simmering tensions to boil over into a full-scale political crisis for the regime. The invasion was not just a military defeat. It was a psychological blow that stripped away the last vestiges of the regime's perceived legitimacy. As the Allies pushed further inland, the urgency of the situation forced the Grand Council to convene for what would be its most consequential session. The meeting was marked by heated debates and a palpable sense of betrayal, as members realized that their own survival depended on abandoning Mussolini. The vote to remove the dictator was a calculated move, a desperate attempt to appease the Allies and perhaps secure more favorable peace terms. When the news of the arrest broke, the reaction across Italy was a complex mix of shock, confusion, and a quiet, cautious sense of relief. The streets of major cities saw spontaneous gatherings, though people remained wary of the potential for a violent crackdown by remaining loyalist forces. Badoglio's government faced the daunting task of maintaining order while simultaneously trying to extricate Italy from its alliance with Nazi Germany. The Germans, sensing the impending betrayal, began to move troops into Italy, transforming the country into a volatile and dangerous theater of war. The secret negotiations with the Allies were fraught with peril, as the new government tried to navigate the demands of both the invaders and the occupiers. Every decision made by the Badoglio administration was scrutinized by the Allies, who were primarily interested in a swift and unconditional surrender. The Italian people, caught in the middle, could only wait and hope that the transition would lead to an end of the relentless bombing. The collapse of the fascist regime was a watershed moment, marking the end of an era that had defined Italy for 2 decades. It was a painful process of national reckoning as the country began to confront the full extent of the damage caused by the war. The transition period was characterized by a profound sense of instability, with the future of the nation hanging in a very delicate balance. The dream of imperial expansion had been replaced by the stark reality of survival, as the country braced for the difficult months ahead. The removal of Mussolini was just the beginning of a long and arduous path toward reclaiming the country's sovereignty and restoring its dignity. History would remember this period as the moment when the Italian state finally broke free from the shackles of its own disastrous political choices. The events of July 1943 remain a testament to how quickly a regime can crumble when it loses the support of its people. As the dust settled on the political upheaval, Italy stood at a crossroads, waiting to see what the next chapter of the war would bring.